And I am honored to have our distinguished guest today, Imam Rizwan Khan Sahib. Imam Sahib, assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So without further ado, we'll let Imam Sahib start and then we'll start taking your questions. So Imam Sahib, if you can go.
So I'll start with just a general introduction of interest, because before we go into the details, it's important to understand the principle. A lot of times when we discuss interest, we get into very detailed questions as to whether a certain type of transaction is forbidden or permitted in Islam. And so to be able to understand those very detailed questions, it's important to have a solid grounding on what the philosophy behind the teaching of interest is. Now Allah Almighty has clearly forbidden the giving and taking of interest in the Holy Quran. And the Holy Prophet ﷺ has given a simple definition of what interest is. When he was asked about it, he asked with another question, which was that, does your money or does your wealth give birth to children? In this analogy, he described that if a person's wealth in and of itself gains more money and multiplies, then that is something that comes under interest. This explanation shows us that in fact, zakat and interest are two opposites, and they have two diametrically opposed purposes which they seek to accomplish. When a person pays zakat, then essentially the Islamic Sharia penalizes that person for accumulating money that is not being circulated in society and is not benefit to the people around them. When a person receives interest on a loan that they give, then that person is in fact rewarded for accumulating and hoarding money that is not in circulation in society in the form of a business or investment. So these are two opposite teachings and principles that are given through zakat and through interest. And the reason why interest is forbidden is because it exploits those people who are poor and who do not have money. So this is the basic philosophy of why zakat is taught in Islam and why interest is forbidden. And so when we look at any specific situation and try to understand whether that comes under the category of interest or not, we can gauge it by this principle. Then also the promised Messiah ﷺ has given a simple definition of interest as well, which is that when we lend someone money with the pre-arranged fixed amount that we are to receive back in addition to what we gave, that also comes under the definition of interest. And any transaction that comes under that category and definition would be something that is classified as interest. So interest is something that goes against the financial philosophy of the teachings of Islam, and also it is something that is harmful to society. And this is the reason why Allah Ta'ala has forbidden it in the Holy Quran.
Jazakallah, Imam Sahib. Thank you for giving us a wonderful insight in why interest is haram. So we can go to our first question, which has come in. And this questioner is asking, is investing in the stock market haram?
Investing in the stock market is not forbidden because it is a means by which a person invests into a number of businesses. A person can invest into one business, they can invest into multiple businesses. And so that's essentially what the stock market is, to try and see to what extent a business is going to succeed or fail. So interest is where a person invests their money into something by means of giving a loan. And they are guaranteed to receive that money back by means of that contract. And then they receive something extra back in return because of the fact that they lent that individual money. Investing in the stock market does not come under that definition, a normal investment in the stock market, because a person shares in the gains and in the loss, the profit and the loss of that investment. And so this is the reason why this doesn't come under the category of interest. So this is one principle that we can keep in mind. If we lend someone money, let's say not even in the stock market, but one individual, we lend someone money for the sake of their business. If we share in the loss of their business and in the profit in their business, then that is called an investment and it is not called interest. But if we receive a guarantee that we will not suffer a loss because of the loss of that business, and because of the favor that we did to that individual, we will receive some kind of monetary stipulated benefit, then that will not be an investment, but that will be interest.
Jazakallah. Let's go to our second question. I just want to remind the reviewers the 3 avenues that you can submit your questions live. This program is live, so you can continue to send your questions while we're live. The first avenue is the website, mkalearn.org. You can submit your questions anonymously there. Or if you have a Twitter account, you can go and tweet us with your question and tag us at MKALearn. And third is you can ask your question here in the YouTube channel at youtube.com/MuslimYouthUSA. So Imam Sahib, the second question came in, and the questioner is asking if you can explain why having a second mortgage is haram, and if we have it for investment purposes, how is that different from a business loan?
So this goes into the first question of why it is that mortgages are permitted at all. A mortgage is essentially a loan that the bank gives for buying a house, and then eventually after a period of however many years it is, 15, 20 or 30 years, a much larger sum of money is given back in return for that. Now on the surface it seems to be clearly interest, and any kind of loan where there is a stipulation that a greater amount of money will be given back is something that is forbidden in Islam. The promised Messiah ﷺ has explained this in detail himself, where he was asked about business loans that sometimes a person is compelled to have to take on interest. The promised Messiah ﷺ explained that there is no situation where a believer is actually forced into doing something that is illegal and that is haram. And no matter what the pressure is, a person is not permitted to give or take interest in the religion of Islam. So necessity is not something that can make something permissible, whether it is a business loan or a personal loan. If something is forbidden clearly in Islam, then that is the fact that it is forbidden. The promised Messiah ﷺ gave an analogy that even if Allah Almighty had forbidden the drinking of water from the earth, then Allah Ta'ala would have provided us enough water from rain to be able to drink. So this line of logic that if I do not pay interest, then I will not be able to find a house, or I will not be able to survive in business, this is a line of logic that the promised Messiah ﷺ has rejected. And he has said that if we start to look at the commands of Islam from this line of thought, then all of the Holy Quran will be left as being nothing. We will begin to rationalize the compromise on every single commandment. So when it comes to mortgage, the permissibility of mortgage does not have to do with necessity. It's not because we need it so badly, so therefore it is permissible in that situation. The reason mortgage is permitted is because it falls into a gray area when it comes to interest. It is not a simple loan that the bank gives to an individual, and then they use that money to purchase the house, and then the house enters into their property, and then they give that loan back over a period of 30 years. What happens in a mortgage, in fact, is that the bank gives a person the money to be able to buy the house, but the bank keeps ownership of the house to the extent that even if a person at the very end of their 30 years on their mortgage payments fails to make the payments that are due, then the bank still holds within themselves the right to be able to foreclose that house and confiscate it and take it into their own ownership. So what we see is that that house is never the property of that individual for the period of those 30 years. He is in fact living in a house that is owned by the bank. And so for that reason, technically what he is paying, what is described as interest, is in fact a rent that he is paying to the bank. So Islam has taught that it is interest, it is usury, it is riba that is forbidden. And what is in fact interest, that is what is forbidden. Now a person, he can call something which is rent as giving it the label of interest, but that doesn't make it interest, it remains what it is. And in the same way, some people, they try and justify the giving and taking of interest as calling it munafa or something like that in certain Muslim countries. And their changing the name of it to something other than interest does not make it be interest no longer. So what we look is the actual essence of what is being taken and what is being given. So in mortgages, we see that it comes under a gray area, where it is something that technically is not clear interest, but there is something that is mixed in that process, and there is something that is in the gray area. And so that is why it has been permitted on an individual level. Now the actual question is that why, if it is permitted in principle for an individual to take on a home that they live in, then why is it not permitted by the Jamaat to be taken for investment purposes or for buying as something that is extra from beyond what a person lives in? Now the reasoning, as I understand for this, and the reasoning might be something else, but as I understand it, is that this, because it is something that comes under a gray area, and so it is not absolutely forbidden, but is not encouraged either. Those things that are in a gray area, they are permissible in certain situations, but they are discouraged in other situations. For example, we have the eating of swine. Now the eating of swine is something that is forbidden in normal circumstances, but it is permitted when we are forced to the point of necessity of having to save our own lives. This analogy does not apply exactly to interest. Hazrat Muslim Maud explained this as well, that You see, the eating of swine is something that is permitted in extreme circumstances, but the taking and giving of interest is something that is completely forbidden. Not even in extreme circumstances is it forbidden. But mortgage is something that is not completely interest, it is a gray area. And so from that perspective, it has been permitted by Huzur Ayyadahullah Ta'ala bin Nasr al-Aziz for the purpose of a house that an individual lives in. But since it comes under that gray area, so where there is no necessity, there mortgage is something that is not permitted where it is done completely out of choice, where it is done for the sake of a person's business. So when it is under the category of personal ownership of a house that a person is living in, there it is in an individual capacity. But when it goes into the point of business and making a business out of that gray area, then it takes on a new light. It takes on a communal sort of activity that previously was an individual activity. So mortgage is something that comes under a gray area. It is not interest in its technical term, but it is also not completely permitted as well. And so because of that gray area, it has been allowed for the sake of extreme circumstances or for the sake of necessity. However, for the sake of a purely voluntary thing that a person wishes to profit off of, there it is something that is discouraged and has not been allowed by our Khalifa.
Jazakallah. So then, just to follow up on that, you said that mortgages are driven by necessity, but if somebody wanted to rent, is that more preferable than to taking out a mortgage if if that interest is not there?
So this is something that is up to an individual decision. Huzur has permitted it, and there we can decide according to our taqwa. As far as clarity goes on whether it is better to take something on mortgage or to pay about the same amount in rent and never come into ownership of that house, there it would seem on the surface that perhaps it would be better to avoid that mortgage altogether and steer clear in that area. Now when Hazrat Khalifatul Masih Rabi rahimahullah ta'ala would be asked more detailed questions when it came to the gray areas of what is permissible in interest and what is not permissible, the advice he would give is that there it is best to not ask too many questions, because if the answer is given, then it may place a greater burden on that individual than he is able to have. So where there is a gray area in something that is as intricate as the giving and taking of interest, there our Khalifa has given us an answer on principle of what is permitted and what is not permitted within that gray area. But then when it comes to deciding based on taqwa, whether it is a higher path of taqwa to avoid mortgage altogether because it is in the gray area, or a person deciding that since it is permitted, so it is fine to take it within the bounds that our Khalifa has permitted us, to decipher which is on a greater level of taqwa, that is up to the individual and is something that probably would cause more confusion if an outright fatwa was given on it.
Jazakallah. Before we move into our next question, I just want to remind the viewers again how to submit your questions. MashaAllah, there's a lot of questions coming in, so keep them coming. We'll try to get them all in this program as we can. The first avenue is Twitter. You can go and tweet your question and tag us at MKALearn. Or you can go on our website, mkalearn.org. Or you can go to the YouTube comments below and ask your questions there. So Murabi Sahab, the next question is related to interest-free banks. There's a lot of Muslim-owned banks, and in the Islamic world, there's a lot of banks that claim to have interest-free banking. What is that, and are we allowed to use that?
Our responsibility is to look at what exactly it is that they offer. Just simply because someone calls something as being interest-free and they've done nothing but change the name of interest to munafa or some other word that sounds Islamic, it does not necessarily make something as Islamic. And so it doesn't matter whether it is a Muslim who is charging us interest or an atheist or a Christian who is charging us interest. Our command for us in the Holy Quran is that interest is something that is not permitted. And the promised Messiah ﷺ has been clear on the fact that both the giving and the taking of interest is something that is forbidden. So whether it is whoever it is that owns the bank or whoever it is that charges or the interest or rent or loans the money, that is irrelevant. No, we don't look at who it is that is responsible for the transaction. We look at what the actual transaction is. And so this is something that has been mentioned in a few of the question answers as well, which is that if the person changes the word of interest to munafa, then is it permitted? It is not permitted at all. Simply changing the word from riba or interest or usury to some other word does not change the nature of what it is. And in the same way, if we refer to something that isn't interest as being interest in our ordinary vernacular, that also does not make it forbidden. But the way we decide these things is to analyze it according to the definition that the promised Messiah ﷺ gave, and primarily by the definition that the Holy Prophet ﷺ gave. That if it is money that is lent to us with a contract of a stipulated amount from beforehand, that a certain amount will be given back to that individual on top of the money that was loaned to us, then that is interest. However, what we see from the example of the Holy Prophet ﷺ is that whenever he took a loan from someone, then voluntarily he would give them more money back on the return of it. And that was according to the verse of the Holy Quran that what is the recompense of a good deed but a good deed in return. So this is what the promised Messiah ﷺ has described as well. That when someone returns a loan to us and they give us more than we had actually lent them in the first place, then that is permitted only if there was no expectation on our part and no stipulation on our part from beforehand that we will receive a greater amount. And so, if in a loan with a Muslim, that person does not expect to receive anything, there is no pressure that is placed on us and it is not stipulated, and we give them greater money back than they lent, or we receive greater money back, then that is perfectly in line with Islam. But anytime there is any expectation or stipulation, then it comes under the category of interest.
Jazakallah, Imam Sahib. Without further ado, let's go to our next question. The next question is the user is asking if we can keep the money that accrues from interest in our savings account. So like a lot of the savings account nowadays, they accrue interest. Are we allowed to keep that? And if not, what should we do with it?
The promised Messiah ﷺ guided us that if a person is put in a situation where they are required to take interest, and it's something that they don't have power to control, then what they can do and what Allah Ta'ala has permitted is that that person can give that interest for the sake of the propagation of Islam. And the reason is that the consuming of the money that we receive as interest is something that is forbidden for us, but it is not forbidden for Allah Almighty. So in that situation, a person is not permitted to use it on himself. That person cannot even use it on his family, and also that person cannot give it to sadaqah even. But it can only be given, the promised Messiah ﷺ said, as it was revealed to him from Allah Almighty, that it can only be given for the sake of the propagation of Islam. And that also is only a temporary measure, so long as Islam is in a state where it is being attacked from all sides and there is no one in the world to support the mission of the promised Messiah and his khulafa. Now, one wisdom in what the promised Messiah ﷺ taught here is that this is a command that only applies during the years and during the age of the weakness of Islam. This reason in and of itself will naturally go away when the religion of Islam begins to dominate the world, because then a system of banking will begin to come into the world where there is an availability of being able to invest our money and place our money in banks where there is no interest-based system. So this is one of the beauties of this advice that the promised Messiah ﷺ gave us, that he said that there is a temporary nature in this advice, that only so long as Islam is weak can we give that money for the sake of the propagation of Islam. But as Islam begins to be strengthened and begins to be propagated in the world, then the need for having to do this will go away, because the Islamic economic system will begin to be established. Another avenue that the promised Messiah ﷺ taught, and what was further emphasized by our khulafa, is that if a person is forced to take interest in a certain place, and then elsewhere, because of business investments that are outside of his control, he is forced to give interest in the giving and taking of money, then he can take that money which he receives, he is forced to receive an interest, and put it towards the money that he is forced to give an interest. And through that separate account that he keeps of the money that he loses and gains through interest, if he can equal it out, then that is something that is permissible as well. But here again, this is something that is only allowed out of necessity. It is not that we deliberately try to place our money in a bank that gives us a better amount of interest that we can receive, and then we choose to go into credit card debt or whatever it is where we have to give interest, and then try and naturally balance out the two interests. This is only where we are in a situation where we are compelled to giving or taking interest, and there it can be balanced out, the two accounts of the amount of money that we give and the amount of money that we take in interest.
Jazakallah. Just to follow up, I know for myself, my savings account, I accrue maybe a couple of cents each year in interest. So would that same process apply? Would I still need to go out and give those couple of cents out, or is there another way we can solve that?
Yes, essentially, it doesn't matter what the amount is, but whatever that amount is, then that should be given for the sake of Allah Almighty. Whatever we give for the sake of Allah Almighty is something that is appreciated in His sight, even if it is a very small amount. And that is why we encourage people that even if they can't afford any amount of financial sacrifice, even if the amount they're giving is so insignificant that it actually perhaps costs more to write it out on a receipt and give them the receipt for it, even then for the sake of the intention, they should do so for the sake of Allah Almighty. And so this applies to this money as well. The fact is that interest is something that has been forbidden, and it is necessary to give it for the sake of Allah Almighty to purify our wealth. Now, this is one of the aspects of financial sacrifice that has been described in the Holy Quran and in a hadith. Specifically to this situation, but in generality I think it does, is that if we are given a glass of milk and we are told that in that glass of milk there is only one drop of urine that is mixed in, then we would never want to drink from that glass of milk. So in the same way, if there is a few cents of interest that are mixed into our wealth, and interest is something that is forbidden to us, then even if it requires going to some degree of inconvenience, we should take that interest money that is something that we do not have a right over and then give it for the sake of the propagation of Islam.
Jazakallah. Imam Sahib, we have a lot of questions coming in, so I'm trying to fit all of these questions in this program. But if we do not get your questions in time, just continue to ask them, continue to tweet us, continue to send them on the website, and then we will, if you leave your contact information, we'll get those answered for you as soon as possible. So without further ado, let's go to our next question. The next question is a follow-up from a previous answer you gave about investing in stock markets. You said that's allowed. But is it also true, can we also invest and sell and buy currencies?
The promised Messiah ﷺ was asked about the amount of money that sometimes people charge for the exchanging of currency. That when a person buys currency from the person who exchanges currency, then in the process of that exchanging of currency, they don't give the exact amount that is the exchange rate, but they charge a bit of extra. And so he was asked that, is that something that is forbidden in Islam? And the answer he gave is that no, that does not come under interest, because that person invests his money in being able to provide all of those different currencies to be available for those people who need it. And so there's an investment of time and effort on that individual. And if he charges you for that investment, then that is something that doesn't come under interest, but it is something that is generally permitted. Now this question is about whether we can save up or buy a certain currency and then wait for, if we anticipate that the value of that currency will increase or whether it will decrease. So does that come under interest? Now here we have to simply apply the definition of interest that the promised Messiah ﷺ gave us. And when we give someone money with the expectation that we will receive that same amount of money back, and it is agreed upon in the contract that we will receive more back. When we apply that definition to people who invest in currencies, we see that that definition doesn't apply. In fact, there is no guarantee for the person who invests in that currency. Now, if I invest in euros or any other currency, then I invest in a way that involves a possibility of gain and a possibility of loss. If according to my understanding of the future prospects of the market, I estimate that the value of the euro is going to increase, then because of that knowledge and wisdom of mine, I will be able to increase on that investment. And then perhaps because of my foolishness, I may lose money as well. So investing in currency is something that involves a possibility of gain and a loss, and there is no contract anywhere where a person is guaranteed contractually to receive that same amount of money back along with any extra amount. And so by that definition, it does not come under interest.
Jazakallah. The next question comes in. The user is asking, is 401ks allowed as it's an investment? And what if the companies in our portfolio deal with un-Islamic things? For instance, a company that processes pork.
So what is asked is that essentially investing in the stock market, that's essentially, as I understand, what 401k is. And it's just a certain amount of money that is invested over a long period of time. And so that's no different than generally investing in the stock market. whether we're investing in one company or 5 companies or 100 companies or even 1,000 companies. It is something that involves investing in the stock market and investing in a business. And also, there is an element of loss and an element of gain. So there it is something that doesn't come under the direct definition of interest because there is a possibility of loss and gain. If in that 401k there is a guarantee of gain because it is being invested in interest-based loans, then that is something that may be forbidden. Now the other part of the question, which is that if that money is being invested in something that is forbidden, then does that make that business or does it make that investment something that is disallowed for us? Now here, the question is essentially asking that if we are investing $1 or $1,000, does it make a difference? Now clearly we know, you and I know, that to invest in a business, for example, alcohol, let's say, or something that is completely illegal, let's say prostitution is allowed in a certain country, if we find that to be a lucrative business and we invest our life savings in it, it is obviously something that is not allowed because we are investing in something that is forbidden in Islam. And so this also applies to pork as well, where Huzur Ayyadahu Ta'ala bin Nasr al-Aziz has advised us in one of his khutbat that that's something which is forbidden for us. We should also not serve it to others, and it is something that we should go into a different business for going into. So what this question is essentially asking is that if something is forbidden but we only benefit and profit from it to a very small degree, then is it something that is forbidden or is it something that is allowed? In my understanding, we come back to the same analogy that if one drop of urine is mixed into a glass of milk, then our nature would be repulsed by that glass of milk. And so it is something that is best to completely avoid because there is something that is forbidden. So if we were to invest in a 401k and we have $20,000 invested, and even if one of those dollars is going to be invested into a brothel, then that's something that is not permitted for us. If even $1 is being invested into a company that deals with drugs or alcohol, then that is also something that is not permitted. And so this is the principle as it applies. However, where there is a gray area, where it is something that is outside of our knowledge, or where it is something that doesn't come under a clear definition of interest, there those things are permitted. So in the areas where we see a black and white, there we should entirely avoid it. But those things where it is not a black and white, but it is a gray thing, there we can use our own taqwa to be able to decide to what extent it is permitted for us.
Jazakallah. The next question comes in. The user is asking, if someone is in the cycle of having a loan for business and it's not possible to get out of the loan without declaring bankruptcy, what should one do?
So the question is that a person has a loan and then they were not able to pay back that loan now? And then they have to declare bankruptcy in order to get out of the loan. Well, there's 2 ways that this question can be addressed. One is that it depends on the motive of the person. If a person has taken out a loan based on interest, and so let's say he accepts Islam, and so now he understands that the giving of interest is something that is forbidden, and so I should not give that interest anymore, then he wishes to declare bankruptcy to be able to get out of paying that interest because of his change in religious beliefs, then is that permitted? And the second question, the second aspect of the intention is that that person is genuinely unable to be able to pay that loan, and so can that person declare bankruptcy for the sake of getting out of paying the loan? Now, when it comes to the first case, this is something that the Promised Messiah ﷺ was asked, where a person said that he asked the Promised Messiah ﷺ to pray for him because he was greatly in debt and he did not have any way of getting out of it. The Promised Messiah ﷺ asked him that what happened? Why are you in debt? Where did this come from? And he said most of it is because of interest that I have to pay on loans that I took in the past. So the Promised Messiah ﷺ said that this is the consequence of your own actions. You are suffering the consequence of your own actions. So if a person, because of his own misdeeds and his mistakes, has to pay interest, then that person has to fulfill that contract that he has to someone else. Now, if a person does tawbah and he was taking interest from people, then there he has a power within himself. If I was taking interest from people and I had lent people money, then there I have the power to say, okay, from now on I forgive everybody the interest that they had to pay me, and I won't take any more interest. It's in my power, and it's to my financial detriment. And there also the promised Messiah ﷺ was asked about this, and he said that so long as a person is capable, he should undo the damage that he had done. That is the meaning of tawbah. And so far as he can, he should give back the money to the people that he took from them in interest, as far as he knows and as far as he is capable. But when a person is giving somebody a loan, there he is contractually obligated. And simply the convenience of changing his religious beliefs does not get him out of that financial obligation that he has. And so there he would have to pray to Allah Almighty to be able to be pulled out of that difficulty that he is in. Now the second intention that a person can have in this situation is that he is simply unable to pay that loan, and he has to file for bankruptcy because he is unable to pay that loan. Now this question goes away from the topic of interest and more into what is the nature of bankruptcy laws in this country, and to what extent the person who gave the loan suffers a loss, and whether it is fair to that person that he is not receiving the money that he was owed. That's something that goes into a separate issue, or we would have to go into the intricacies of the validity of the bankruptcy laws of here in the United States and other countries, and how they perhaps usurp the rights or are according to the rights, Islamic rights, of the lendee and the lender that Islam has taught. So that is a separate question.
Jazakallah. Our next question is, are credit card reward points allowed?
So this goes into a question of, it's not something that is an amount of money that we are stipulated to receive as a result of money that we saved, but it is rewards that we receive for spending money and borrowing money from the bank. Now here again, let's take the definition that the promised Messiah ﷺ gave on the giving and taking of interest and see if it applies to us in this situation. Now when we give money, let's say when we give money to the bank, when we invest our money and we save it in the bank, there the money that we place in our bank account is used by the bank, and they receive it as if it is a loan that we are receiving from them. And so because we have given the bank a loan, they stipulate a certain amount of money that they will give back to us. And so that's why it's considered something that is a profit that we receive. However, with the points that we earn on our credit cards, or the points that we earn for spending a certain amount of money, if that is a reward that we receive simply because we are using money, simply because we are using that credit card, then there it is not any kind of loan on the surface, as it seems, that we are giving to the bank that the bank is benefiting from. But it is the bank rewarding us for spending a certain amount of money. Now this is something that doesn't apply if a person spends money purely on their debit card. Now also another angle that we have to take into consideration is the fact that do we earn those points because of the interest that we pay, or do we earn those points simply because of the money that we have spent and that we are paying on our credit card payments on time? If it is points that we are earning because of the interest that we pay, which generally is not the case, then if it has nothing to do with interest, then in my estimation it doesn't come under that definition that the promised Messiah ﷺ gave us. So essentially what the bank rewards us on is spending money. For example, if a person buys something in bulk, then a company has a right to give that person a benefit of buying those things in bulk. If a person pays fully in a large amount or for an investment, pays a down payment or for a large amount, then that company has a right to give that person some kind of financial benefit for their business, for the reliability of their business. And so if the points that credit cards give is a reward for a person's business that they give, for the reliability of their business or for the investment that they put in, there does not come under the category of interest as far as I understand it.
Jazakallah. This next question comes from, I guess, a lot of students out there. They're asking, are student loans permitted? I know there's a lot of students that are out there listening, watching right now, and they want to know if they're allowed to have student loans.
We have to ask ourselves again, taking the definition that the promised Messiah ﷺ has given, as to what degree interest applies to on that student loan. Now, it doesn't matter how noble the purpose for a loan is, the nobility of that purpose does not make it permissible. For example, I cannot use money, gain money by illegal purposes and then use it for a good cause and it becomes a good deed. Just to give an extreme example. Now, for example, the Jamaat does not take chanda from people who run businesses that go contrary to the teachings of Islam. And the reason for that is that no matter how noble their purpose is in giving for the sake of Allah Almighty, but the essence of what we are trying to achieve is a nearness of Allah Almighty. So a person cannot have a noble purpose and then do something that is wrong. So also, as the promised Messiah ﷺ described, that when people said that for very extreme situations we can't do business and we can't survive and we can't support ourselves without taking taking a loan that is based on interest, the answer that he always gave was that Allah Ta'ala has given this teaching. And if our perspective on that teaching is that it is impossible to survive without breaking that teaching, then it raises an objection to Allah Almighty, that perhaps He has given us a teaching that goes contrary to the very nature of the world that He has created. Now when we look at student loans, there is a stipulation that for a certain amount of time, if a person gives that loan back within a certain stipulated period, then that person is not going to be charged interest. And so for that situation, it is something that is permitted. However, more often than not, that period of time is something that is so short that most people are never able to pay back that loan within the stipulated amount of time. And so if a person is required to pay interest on that student loan, and if it comes under the definition that the promised Messiah ﷺ has given, in that is a loan that that person has taken, and then he is stipulated to give back that amount with a greater amount, then it would be something that is not permitted. However, if there is any kind of gray area in that loan, any further stipulations, for example, what comes with mortgage where the bank actually maintains ownership of that person's house and he's actually living in that person's house, then if there's a gray area with student loans, then perhaps it is something that can be considered. But as I understand student loans in the most basic and straightforward sense, then it is something that comes under a very basic and simple interest-based loan where the bank gives a person money, they buy the classes that they need to, and then over a long period of time they give back the bank that same amount of money plus a certain amount that is stipulated with interest. So according to my basic understanding of what a student loan is, according to the definition of the promised Messiah _, that would come under interest and it would not be permitted. However, if there are further gray areas, and that is something that can be looked into.
Just a follow-up, do you know of any alternatives they can do if there is no gray area? Is there any other way that a student can go to college if they can't afford it at that particular moment?
What the basic philosophy that Islam has taught is that there should be an interdependency when it comes to finances. Now, this is why interest is something that has been forbidden in Islam. The fact is that the very nature of interest-based loans is something that attacks the very root of our community, of our ability to be combined together and to be rooted in a community. If we do not have an interest-based system, then you can imagine that there's this whole different type of communal system. If a person needs to build a house, then their entire family comes together to help them. If a person's house burns down, then in those communities, the community comes together to support that person to be able to build a new house. In our system and in the lives that we live in, because our society is so well built around an interest-based system, we've become very non-community oriented. And where in a normal society, a person would feel perfectly comfortable asking a loan from their extended family members, from their friends, from their community to be able to do something that they need. Now it's something that we never ask for. It is something that we have no interdependency on. Instead, the very system of interest has destroyed our interdependency with our neighbors, and we are all individually dependent on large banks and large financial systems. So what Islam has taught is that rather than being dependent on large financial systems, and as a result losing that brotherhood and sisterhood that is created in communities because of that financial dependency that we have on each other. So instead of that, we should try and develop a greater dependency upon each other. And it should not be something that we are ashamed to do. Now, we often are ashamed to ask for a loan from those who are our family members. We think that we're somehow begging or we're somehow coming under the favor of that person. But we see the example of the Holy Prophet ﷺ that he many times took a loan from people, sometimes from his companions and sometimes from non-Muslims, from the Jewish members of the community that lived around him. So there's no shame in asking for a loan. And this is actually something that creates a community brotherhood and sisterhood and an interdependency that makes us better neighbors with each other. And so this is the principle of what Islam has taught. And so interest and the giving and taking of interest is actually something that flourishes based on that sense of shame that this system has created within us, and being financially dependent on these large projects when it comes to asking one another for a loan and then paying them back and then doing ihsan. So you can imagine the Islamic community system where if I take money from someone and then I give them back a little bit extra as a favor, what kind of brotherhood it would create, and when someone knows that they can count on me to be able to give them a loan.
Jazakallah. I'm sorry to keep pounding on this question. We have a lot of questions, but I just have one more follow-up question for that. So for all the students out there, to all the people that are out there that have taken that student loan, is there something we can do? Do we have to do tawbah or something, or what can we do now after the fact?
As this is related to the question that was asked before, now if a person has taken a loan, an interest-based loan that is forbidden in Islam, then that person has to pay the loan that he has promised to give because he is contractually obliged to do so. And so all he can do at that point is to pay that loan and then to make a promise to himself to not to commit that mistake again. Now when it comes to student loan, as I said before, that if that student loan that that person took comes under the clear stipulation that Hazrat Masih Maud has given, then it is defined as interest. And each person can look under the stipulation of what their student loan is. Now since I may not have clarity on what each person's individual student loan is, or perhaps there's some gray areas that I'm unaware of because of my lack of knowledge on the complexities of that system. So there may be a gray area where it does not in fact come under the clear definition of interest. But according to my general understanding of what a student loan is, essentially it is a loan that a person takes where the person is given money on a stipulation of returning all that money to the bank with a greater amount of interest that is to be given to that person, that is to be given to the bank. So if it comes under that clear definition, then it is interest. But if there's any gray areas which we can go into the complexities of in the future, then perhaps in that case it wouldn't come under interest. So each of those cases has to be taken along with its the complexity that is involved.
Jazakallah. So let's move on to our next question. The question is asking about, so the user is asking if he makes an investment with the possibility of gaining of a gain or a loss, is that considered gambling? Is that allowed?
If there is an investment where there's a possibility of a loss or a gain for that individual, because of the loss or gain in that business, then it is not gambling. Otherwise, in every kind of gambling, there is a gain or there is a loss. That's just the fact of the matter. So one example that I think makes this easier to understand is the way people gamble on sports, fantasy sports or whatever it is. Let's say somebody is betting on a team. Now, if I am betting on a certain game, let's say a basketball game or a football game, then I'm betting on the outcome of that game. And so that's something that's not really an investment, but it is just money that I'm putting forward based on possibilities. That same thing applies to a horse race or anything that happens where I'm just guessing on who might win and who might lose. Now, I'm not investing into the team. This is just a pool of money that I and my friends would have, and then whoever wins because of the luck or because of their best knowledge or understanding, they would end up getting the money. So that's not a business investment, that's actually gambling because of the money is not going to that business. It's actually just staying among us friends. Now what's not gambling is, for example, if I invest my money in a certain team. So let's say I'm a fan of the Washington Redskins and I invest my money in the business of the Washington Redskins. It goes towards buying them equipment, towards paying the salaries of the player. Then if the team does well and they win the Super Bowl and then they receive a return on their investment, that's something that's not gambling because my money is actually going to the business and I'm benefiting from the success of that business or for the loss of that business. However, when I have a circle of friends and we invest in whether a team is going to win or lose, and none of that money is going towards benefiting that business, buying them equipment or anything, it's just held in a circle, and then whoever wins, all of the money in that circle goes to that individual. That is not a business investment by any stretch of the imagination because it doesn't go to the business. That is something that is gambling, and that is why it comes under the category and the definition of gambling.
Jazakallah. We go on to our next question. Just reminding viewers how to ask your questions. There's still time to ask questions. You can go tweet us at MKALearn, or you can go to our website, mkalearn.org. You can submit anonymously, or you can go to our YouTube channel right below and ask us questions in the comment section below. Rabbi Saab, the next question is pertaining to currency. The question is, the currency devalues with time due to inflation. So the justification of taking interest is that it counters inflation. Is that justifiable?
This is something that can only be decided based on the guidance of the Khalifa of the time. And so as far as I'm aware, there is no permission for this that has been given as of yet. Because the promised Messiah ﷺ has given a very specific definition of the use of interest. And the definition that he has given is that it is only permitted for the propagation of Islam and for nothing else. And also, if it is used to counter other interests, then it is permissible in that situation. So when the promised Messiah ﷺ has said that we cannot even use that interest for the sake of our children and even to give as sadaqah to poor people, then to counter that, the money that we receive as interest because of the inflation of the currency, that is something that also cannot be permitted. And one analogy that I can give of it is that let's say anything is forbidden. Now, like I said previously, let's say a person makes money for something that is illegal, or they make money off of drugs. Now, simply because they use it towards something that is good doesn't make it something that is better. A person is not permitted to use that drug money for anything because it is illegally attained money. It's something that is forbidden for him. So in the same way, interest is something that is forbidden for us. And so whether we use it on ourselves to counteract some other greater loss is something that is not permitted. So it's not really, the question of interest doesn't enter into this situation. This question might be valid when it comes to the question of zakat, because the very philosophy of zakat is that when a person hoards money, then it negatively affects society because that money is not in circulation. So a person could possibly argue that since our economic system is in a way that even our currency is something that is in circulation involuntarily and it inflates. So a person might be able to argue that if I save up currency, then the loss of money and inflation shows that that money is being used in business investments without my knowledge. And so perhaps that absolves me of zakat. And that is something that perhaps could be justifiable, and with the permission of the Khalifa, it could be a question that is asked of the Khalifa. But when it comes to interest, it has nothing to do with the money itself. This is money that is externally coming in. And so we cannot dictate where it goes to compensate what loss and what other loss. The only thing it can be used is to compensate the loss of interest that we are forced to pay elsewhere, or for the propagation of Islam and for nothing else.
Jazakallah. Rabbi Sahib, unfortunately, we're running out of time. I think we have time for one small answer, one short question, and that just to wrap it up. And that question is, how can we refrain from interest in this modern world? Like, is there any way that we can refrain from it?
As we went over before, the promised Messiah ﷺ said, essentially what he described was that where there is a will, there is a way. If it seems impossible on the surface to abstain from interest altogether, and it seems that we cannot do it, then perhaps we are looking at it from a perspective where we are ourselves confining ourselves to that situation. Where we have a choice, there is always an option, and there is simply a compromise that has to be made. The promised Messiah ﷺ said that it is unfortunate that people rely more on the illegal ways of earning money than they rely on Allah Almighty. Our tawakkul is greater on something that is forbidden than it is on Allah Almighty. We rely more on that door than we do on the door of Allah Almighty. Now when it comes to the very intricate aspects of interest, where a person is not directly in control, where it does not have to do with the individual, but it has to do with money that a person invests perhaps in international banking, and their interest gets mixed into it. There, Hazrat Khalifatul Masih Rabi rahimahullah ta'ala described that since it is something that is completely out of our control, so there a person would be best not to ask too many detailed questions and make a judgment according to taqwa. And so there, to a degree, it is something that it is not completely forbidden. However, there is one area where perhaps we do apply the use of interest in too much of a black and white way, and that is an interesting event that took place during the time of the promised Messiah ﷺ. And it was where the promised Messiah ﷺ was asked that there was a newspaper which was Al-Badr. And what Al-Badr would do is that if someone paid a down payment on the newspaper immediately, then they were charged a certain rate. However, if they decided to pay later on, they promised to pay later on, or they promised to pay in installments, then they would charge a higher rate. And so someone asked the promised Messiah ﷺ that, is this interest? Is this something that is forbidden? The promised Messiah ﷺ said, no, it is not forbidden, because it is a right of that person, that seller, to be able to set the stipulation. And because Al-Badr, the newspaper, has to go through effort of investment to be able to make greater effort to acquire that money later on, so that is why it doesn't come under interest. And so this is why this can apply in other situations as well. No, because the people who asked the question, they said, the writers of Al-Badr said that when a person promises to pay later, then we have to go to the trouble of getting the money from them later. It requires sending letters, getting back letters, pursuing them. It requires our time and effort and investment of our money, in fact, to be able to get that money. And so that's why we charge more later. So it's not that black and white at times as well. If someone is giving us a commodity and they give us a lower price if we pay a down payment, and they give us a higher price because of this effort and the trouble that they have to go through to get the money from us if it's in installments, and there's no exchange of money involved, but it's simply a commodity, then it can perhaps come under a definition that is not interest, and it can come under a different definition. So here also we can keep that in mind, that if it is an exchange of commodities where there is an investment on the part of the person who is giving us that commodity for having us pay in installments, then it may not come under the definition of interest, but it may be something that is permissible in Islam.
Jazakallah, Imam Sahib. That's interesting. You answered the last question that was there, which was about if a seller was selling something and wanted to offer two prices, one for right now and one for a later date. So you answered that without even me asking. That's awesome. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. You can continue to send your questions in, and we will, if you send your information, your contact information, we will have those answered to you as soon as we can. Our next show is in 2 weeks on January 14th, same time, 9 p.m. Eastern time, and we will let you know the topic for that discussion. I want to thank Imam Sahib for taking the time out. I want to thank the team who's running in the behind the scenes. This is a live show, so I want to apologize for any hiccups. I know we had to start again in the beginning, so just forgive us for our miscomings. We're taking them as lessons learned, and we're learning along the way. Hopefully we'll have these issues resolved next week, next episode. So until then, this is Saud Iqbal. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.